Welcome, everybody. So this is the first 60 days of CMMC compliance. And when we say 60 days, we mean since, all of these different CMMC, C3PAO assessments have been able to start. So we have this amazing group of people who have been on the front lines, like it says, from the front lines on CMMC implementation and assessment. So it's going to be a really great overview of kind of the things that we've seen, what things these wonderful people have been dealing with and what you guys will need to know going forward for your assessment. So real quick introductions we'll start with first, then we'll go through a timeline and then get some feedback, obviously, from our esteemed panels on what they've seen in these first 60 days. So I'll start off with the introductions real quick. My name is Noelle Vestal. For those of you who don't know, I am the Chief Compliance Officer for Prevail. Prevail is an end-to-end encrypted email and file storage solution that quite a few of the members of the DIB are using in support of their CMMC Level 2 compliance. At the end of this webinar, we'll have some contact information if you want to, say get a hold of anybody at Prevail and talk to us more about the solution. But that's not really our focus today. So with that, I'll go ahead and start the introduction. So Rob, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'm Rob Teague. I'm Director of CMMC Services here at Redspin. We were one of the first authorized C3PAOs to hit the ecosystem. I'm also a lead CCA, but mostly act as the QA at the C3PAO level. And most important about me, I'm just a kid trying to adult over here.
Thank you, Rob. And Thomas, would you mind giving us a quick introduction as well?
Sure. I'm Dr. Thomas Graham, and I am not the Chief Compliance Officer for Prevail. I am the VP and CISO for Redspin, along with Rob Teague there. Outside the CMMC space, I also spent over a decade in the DoD land as a contractor. I served in various roles to include being ISO at the DISA level, as well as heading up the mitigation and remediation arm of DHA.
Thank you, Thomas. And definitely, last but certainly not least, Matt, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Appreciate that, Noelle. But Matt Bruggeman, nice to meet you all. I'm here with A-LIGN. We are obviously a C3PAO. We do all sorts of cybersecurity assessments. So I'm a director over some of our federal services. So CMMC and FedRAMP being the main areas of focus there. So day in and day out, I'm talking and working with clients about their path towards CMMC, FedRAMP. Obviously, we're going to be talking more CMMC here today. So excited to be here. Appreciate you guys.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. I think there are a lot of questions here. I mean, I know we have a whole lot of questions to even get through. So we'll go ahead and get started then. Perfect. So we just wanted to give a quick level set for everybody out there. So currently, this is our sort of proposed timeline. So CMMC, for those of you who are not aware, went into effect on December 16th of 2024. Right about the first week of January, roughly, is when C3PAOs were allowed to start doing their assessments. But CMMC itself, the actual law, although it is effective, doesn't really have an implementation method. And what does that mean? So you'll see here CMMC is effective, but then next to it in the May blue block, that second blue block, you'll see something called Title 48 Rule CMMC enters into contracts. So that is what is commonly referred to as the companion legislation to the final rule that came out in December for CMMC. This companion legislation, once it comes out, we do not know when that's going to come out. In theory, it's going to come out sometime, in the first part of this year, but we haven't seen anything yet. When that does come out, there'll be a 60-day review period. And then once that review period is over, then that will also become an effective rule. When that effective rule comes into play and does become effective, let's say that, the effective date is June 1st. Then June 1st of 2025 is when phase one of that is laid out in the CMMC final rule. If you're not familiar with that, phase one begins. Then phase two would begin a year later in 2026. So that's why this particular rule is so important, why we have it listed here on the timeline. The other thing that we wanted to mention, this is relatively new. Katie Arrington, for those of you who are familiar with who that is now the CIO, or the Chief Information Officer for the DoD. Katie Arrington was incredibly instrumental in getting CMMC off the ground. In fact, I really think it was very much her baby from everything that I have heard and seen. So for those of you who were concerned about what CMMC was going to do and what path we're going to take, this is a pretty clear indicator that CMMC is sustained and it is going to continue at that high level. enforcement is already being shown in primes. I just had a conversation with a customer right before this who had the exact conversation with me of, our prime is telling us we have to be 110. We have to be compliant with CMMC. I don't know how I'm going to do this. It definitely is coming down from the primes even faster than it is in some cases than it's coming from the government. So that's something to remember too. And remember, CMMC will enter contracts, but it's going to be post that CFR Title 48 when that comes out, what we were just talking about with phase 1. And with that, we have a bunch of different questions and a lot of different things to talk about with you guys here. First and foremost, what do I mean, I'm sure everybody on this call is thinking this. What do OSCs or organizations seeking certification, what is it that they really should be doing to prepare? You know, you guys are all C3PAOs, CCAs who are coming in to do these assessments. What type of documentation, for example, Rob, what type of documentation and technologies do you expect to see in a fully set up, fully ready to go, 110 and a 110 kind of environment?
First of all, out of all the assessments we've conducted to date, we have never seen anybody tackle this the same way. So let's just kind of put that. It's like everybody's coming at this angle to the finish line. It's really interesting. The big thing to remember is that there are non-federal organizations or NFOs that are required under NIST 800-171 Revision 2. And you can find those down in Appendix E of that document. The NFOs are really implied tasks that aren't built within the rule itself, but you got to go down to the appendix to see those. And one of the main things that it drives is policy and a procedure for each of the 14 domains. So we definitely are looking for that. The system security plan is obviously the piece that's the main document we're going to be reviewing. And then, as far as tools, there's a plethora of solutions out there. Just make sure that you have something to monitor your users with. Make sure you have something that's identifying any anomalies or potential incidents. What does that process look like to eradicate that? It's got to be well defined. When we're reading a document, we're looking at, you're really telling us how you're doing this. And then when we sit in the interview session, you're really telling us how you do it based off what we just read in the documentation. So if you wrap all that together, you need policies, procedures, the system security plan, and then whatever other tools you need in order to monitor the users, watch for anomalies and risks.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful way of putting it. It's one thing that we tell our customers all the time. You want to tell a compelling story to your assessor. You want to be able to be honest. And like you said, everything that is in your documentation needs to be what you're actually doing. That seems to be a big issue. So thank you.
Also, real quick, Noel, for your users have to read this documentation. So you want to keep it, a lot of the tech talk out of it and keep it kind of lower level.
Yeah, that's a very good point too. Thomas, I'll ask you this. What are some of the things that you've seen? So we talked about a perfect 110 situation. What are some of the things you've seen where you've walked in and gone, oh man, this is they're missing the mark already? What are some of those lessons learned that we could impart on some of these OSCs who are listening right now?
Well, the first thing is if I walk in and see everybody dressed in black like we are, that's my first sign that, something's wrong because we didn't even coordinate this.
We didn't. No, this was totally just a wonderful accident.
But no, I mean, honestly, when I go in to do an assessment and I'm starting to ask the questions, a lot of times assessors talk about muscle memory, the ability when you ask a question about, can you show me this configuration? They can go right to it. That gives that warm and fuzzy to your assessor. If you start fiddling around, you're not really sure where to find it, that may bring more questions because now in the back of most assessors' heads will probably pop up, well, do you really know this stuff or did somebody just set it up and hand it off to you and you have no clue how to do it? The second thing is kind of piggybacking on what Rob said. Your SSP should provide traceability to your policy and procedure. Your policy and procedure should provide traceability to your configuration. If I'm going through there and, I'm very methodical in my approach, anybody that's been in an assessment with me can probably say that. If your SSP tells me X, your policy kind of alludes to something else, and then you're like, yeah, well, we actually do it this way. Well, there's those items that say define, identify, specify, and then prove to us you're doing it that way. Well, if you don't properly do the define, identify, and specify, we can't properly assess the enforcement. So make sure that there's that traceability.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that's one that that causes some confusion to people. Like you said, you have to be able to trace everything back. And I'm really glad you talked about that hesitation piece. If somebody's sort of clunking around trying to find configurations, doesn't know what they're doing. Yeah, I certainly, as also as an assessor, would be a little concerned about that. Thank you so much, Thomas. Matt, I'm going to ask you this question. So, what are some good surprises that you've seen with readiness when you've been going in and working with these OSCs? What are some things that you're like, oh, well, this is surprisingly nice. Like, I'm really glad to see this.
They have muscle memory and finding their stuff. No, I mean, I think kind of on that point, though, is just there's been some good surprises in terms of real preparedness for the assessment, not just for compliance. And it kind of does go to the muscle memory thing. But if and when an OSC has been really well organized, like they have tabs open for each specific thing that they know they want to show us, like they are not just, hey, I've got muscle memory, I know where to go find this, but like they have it all pulled up and they're ready to rip through it. That's been a pleasant surprise that there has been some of those out there. It's just, and this gets away from the pleasant surprises, but there's just huge variance, right? Between that and the opposite of what we see, which I think is what Dr. Thomas was just talking about. Digging around, fiddling around. Oh, give me a minute, hang on. And we're just sitting there kind of twiddling our thumbs like, oh, this is not great.
Not a good look. Yeah.
Not a good look. And I think he put it well. Like it just raises more questions than anything if that's the case. So I would say kind of the opposite of that has been the pleasant surprises. There have been some cases where you see the absolute opposite, like not only are they like confident in their compliance and everything mapping to each other really well, they're really prepared for the assessment, which I think is another step above that not a lot of OSCs are thinking about quite yet. Hey, I'm compliant. I'll be able to prove this versus, hey, do you have it all ready and readily available and know what to click on, what answer to question when that relevant sort of control or assessment objective pops up. So we have seen some organizations that are at that level of preparedness. So that's been really great to see.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you're absolutely right. Something that I tell our customers all the time, make it as easy for your assessor as you possibly can. Make it easy for them. If you can make it easy for your assessor, you're going to have such a better experience. So in the same vein, Matt, just a real quick follow-up. Those kind of those organizations where you do have people just ready on top, they're ready to go, ready to just bang it out. How long do you feel like is the average, it seems, that they take before they call you? Like how long
will they initially talk to us?
Right, yeah.
So this is interesting. I think there's a couple different components to this. I think there's like an initial conversation with a C3PAO. I would say don't hesitate to have those conversations now. Reach out to multiple C3PAOs, talk to them, ask them about their methodology, get a feel for how responsive they are, how you like working with them. I would say don't hesitate to have that initial sort of call. Obviously, you want to have a good idea of your scope. One of the more frustrating things that can come up when I do have clients reach out early in the process, which is fantastic, but then I'll just ask them very essential scoping questions around their boundary data types, these sorts of things. And they're kind of looking to me for answers. I'm saying that's not what this call is for. That's not what the C3PAO is for, right? It is up to the OSC to define the scope to us, and then we can scope it out and we can tell you what the assessment process is going to look like. But the other side of that is, and part of the reason I say reach out now, start to get a feel for a C3PAO, as soon as you do understand and can identify your scope, backlogs. We haven't talked about it yet. I'm sure Redspin can speak to this as well. Backlogs with C3PAOs are filling up. It is a known thing, but just to state it here for anybody that may not be aware, there's only so many qualified assessors and there's only so many C3PAOs that can perform this work. And there are tens of thousands of organizations that are going to need this in the ensuing years. So the backlogs are continuing to grow. So that's another reason I would say, if this is going to be our priority to you and this DoD business is a priority to you and you want to make it a business differentiator between you and some potential competitors to be an early adopter of this, talk to C3PAOs now. Because the last thing you'd want to do is worry so solely focused on implementation, documentation, and readiness, and then pop out the other end and say, so glad we took that on. Let's start with a C3PAO. And then they're like, cool, we can't start for 6 months. And then shoot, I just screwed up my whole timeline, right?
Right, exactly. No, that's a very good point. And yeah, there definitely is. Yeah, for those of you who are unaware, there is definitely a backlog. And you put it perfectly, Matt. There just aren't enough assessment teams out there that are qualified to do this kind of work, unfortunately. So it's just a very simple supply and demand issue so far. Obviously, we're, the DoD and the Cyber AB are working to change that. But in the interim, you're absolutely right. There are backlogs. I don't think I've spoken to a single C3PAO who doesn't have a backlog right now? And I know it's getting, farther and farther along as obviously you fill up the queue. Thank you, Matt. That was amazing. So to try to kind of shift a little bit back, Thomas, what have you seen as the biggest challenges and when I say biggest challenges, I mean for the OSCs, like what seems to be a consistent, bigger challenge that most of the OSCs you're assessing seem to be experiencing?
Honestly, it's understanding the requirements on the objectives. I think maybe a couple of assessments I've been in, but the majority of the assessments I've been in, there's always been some objective that, we've gotten to where they thought they understood it. But when we got to assessment, it was, no, here's what the requirements really are. And then, they have to try and prove that evidence. Just a couple of case in points for you. Early on, it was dealing with risk assessments and not understanding that just your 800-171 self-assessment is not considered a risk assessment. It's considered a security controls assessment. Another one is understanding, what the requirements that aren't specifically stipulated in the assessment guide actually are. And this alludes to what Rob mentioned early in the conversation. What he alluded to was that Appendix E in NIST 800-171. When you look down there, he mentioned the NFO controls, those items that are expected to be satisfied without specification. However, there is also a CUI category there that has the specific traceability to NIST 800-153 and the subcontrols in 853. For instance, vulnerability scanning. Nowhere in the objectives of the CMMC Level 2 assessment guide does it say you have to do privileged scans. However, you look down in Appendix E, it traces to 853 RA 5 subcontrol 5 that specifically states, yep, you got to do privilege scans. So you go in as an assessor. Okay, show me you're doing vulnerability scanning. All right, cool. Now show me, some kind of evidence that proves to me you're getting privileged scans. What's that? Well, then, you have to explain it, and then they're, kind of fishing for some of the evidence. But those are just a couple of things I've seen.
No, yeah, those are great examples. And
privileged scans as credentialed scans.
yeah, exactly. That's an extremely good point. And Rob, are there any other bigger challenges? I know documentation has been a struggle. Is that something that I know you're laughing because, yeah, we know the answer to this, but
Yeah.
for the audience, for their sake, what are some of the biggest documentation challenges you're seeing?
So some of the biggest ones, folks are addressing the actual 110 requirements versus addressing the 320 objectives. As assessors, when we come in and during training, when we get our certifications, we leverage the 320 objectives to determine if the requirement is being met. So your documentation and evidence should point to each objective. Some of the other things that it was either Thomas or Matt had mentioned it earlier, define. When you see define, that means you've got to have it written somewhere. It could be in an automated tool, or it could be in a spreadsheet or in a book, or a document somewhere, right? An example, one of the biggest ones that's always missed is in configuration management. And it goes to the 3.4.7 requirement, which is identifying all those essential and non-essential programs, functions, protocols, ports, services, etc. When it says define, that means you've got to list them out. Has the organization defined their essential services? Have they defined their non-essential services? We're looking for those specifically, and those are often missed. So they don't have them documented somewhere, or they can't point to them. Risk assessments is the second big one that's kind of moving up on the chart, if you will. Thomas talked about a list of the 10 top failed items that DIBCAC had put out a couple of years ago, where FIPS was typically the number one. That's now shifted because we've talked on so many webinars and podcasts about FIPS. It's slowly starting to move down that list of the missed items. But what's replacing it is risk assessments. So when we come in to do the assessment and we ask you about your risk assessments, they're showing us their IT risks. And that's fantastic. But how does it feed to the organizational risk, and how are they tracking it? Because that's an organizational level requirement. This is the part where we're always talking about. This is not an IT program. This is an organizational lift by the entire team to get this program in place. So we're typically seeing that in the documentation.
That was perfect. Thank you for those examples too, Rob. I think that it really helps to sort of codify it in everybody's mind. To your point, I know that I have had questions about those two particular controls. I don't even know how many times from customers, especially to your point, the risk assessment. And I'm glad, the risk assessment requirement. I'm glad that you brought that up too, because I think there's so much confusion. And Thomas alluded to this earlier too, that, oh, well, if I'm doing a self-assessment, that's a risk assessment. No, 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 no. That self-assessment is just saying, hey, this is where I'm at with the controls. It's not what is the overall risk to the organization, to your point. I think that's such an important point to really drive home for everybody listening. This is not just about cybersecurity and IT. It's about how cybersecurity and IT are infiltrating everything in your organization. So it needs to be very much from the top down, organizational wide, so everybody understands their requirements. So yeah, thank you. That was really important, Rob. I'm glad you brought that up. I'll ask this question of Matt. What would you suggest contractors do before they call you? We just talked about different things that are challenges that we have, but like ideally, if you have somebody who's coming to you and saying, hey, I want to schedule an assessment, where do they need to be?
Well, initially, if we look at the CMMC assessment process cap, phase one, part of that is we have to validate their readiness, the availability of evidence, their system security plan, these sorts of things. So that's kind of the baseline, right? Is like, make sure you have your documentation in place, complete and sufficient. Make sure you have evidence available for us. Like, that is not us making a judgment statement on whether we think you will pass the assessment or not. That is, are you ready to be assessed? Is there evidence here? Is there documentation for us to sufficiently assess whether you are meeting those controls or not? So I would, if anybody isn't familiar with it, I would read through the CAP publicly available document, make sure you're looking at version 2.0. Sometimes when I'm quickly Googling and pulling it up, version 1.0 pops up and I'm like, no, not that one. The most updated one, 2.0. So I would read that, look at phase one, because that's going to be kind of the base initial, hey, these are what we're going to need to supply to the C3PAO. I was thinking, just back to the other question, I just wanted to add one that came to mind in terms of things that we're seeing, and it kind of speaks to this a little bit as well. Just to hone in on, again, the incompleteness of documentation, because we are catching that a lot in phase one. That's what that is for. What we're seeing, in addition to, I agree with both of the examples that Robert and Thomas had brought up, we're also seeing with the documentation and like boundary definitions, just discrepancies. I think we were talking about that before a little bit, but I just wanted to hone in on this a little bit. But particularly, like, one that came to mind recently was around 3.13.1 with boundary protection itself. Not so much struggling with boundary protection, but discrepancies between how they defined it in their boundary and what we're actually seeing them implement in person, right? And so I would say that has far-reaching effects, and we're seeing that across multiple different practices. But along the lines of this question of what do we want to make sure we see in place, don't just get your documentation ready to get your documentation ready. Really make sure that, again, it's part of the full story and that it matches your implementation. Because if you have your documentation together, okay, great, you're going to pass through phase one, but then phase two, once we start actually assessing and validating that the implementation of that meets and matches the definitions of that, that's where we, with some instances, have been running into a lot of a lot of issues with clients just in that discrepancy alone. So I would say, obviously, make sure all of that's ready and complete, but make sure, again, that you are telling a cohesive story and that you're doing what you're saying. And I think a lot of that comes back to, again, what we were talking about before, where maybe this is something that they're kind of trying to just quickly get through. Let's just get CMMC certified, put together this documentation. It's like, no, you have to really think through. Again, this is an organizational approach. We have to all be bought in. We have to all be understanding of what the documentation says, not just to the degree of like being able to answer an interview question around what that says, but actually implementing it, doing it, and being able to prove that you're doing it in person, I think is a completely another thing. And I think if I could summarize like the first 60 days, the biggest sort of takeaway, I would probably say that. I would say, make sure you're doing what you're saying. That's been a big issue for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine it is. Yeah, Rob, would you?
Yeah, no, Matt, you bring up a great point. The first 60 days, what we've seen is a sprint for everybody to get to their certification. But what they're forgetting is that this is a marathon, because you got to manage this for the next
However long you got
however
the
many years,
contract.
right?
Yeah.
So the more you have this defined to where your users can go in, read that documentation, and understand how the environment is working and what they can and can't do to protect that data, plays a vital role. The other piece to remind everybody is all of the authorized C3PAOs have gone through this assessment once and twice. Many of us have been recertified already. So ask the C3PAOs when you get on the call with them, what did you guys do to get certified? How did you get to the finish line? What hiccups and bumps did you guys run over? I know when we started, I invested heavily in stocks with Jack Daniels and leveraged that drink quite a bit as we were preparing, because it was very stressful. Even for the C3PAOs, we get stressed. So it's just part of the whole process.
That's a good
God
point. I
forbid.
think,
That's a very good point. Yeah. Sorry.
I was just gonna say, I think a lot of times OSCs might have an attitude of like, oh, you don't get it. You're just the one that has to audit us. But Rob brings up a good point that I think is good to stress to them. Like, we've been through this ourselves as well. So we do get it. We do understand. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I know that this isn't necessarily the discussion right now, but think about this as a long-term, compliance for, X number of years that you want to maintain. I think Rob and I were chatting about that recently, how I think we're both seeing just dead focus, understandably dead focus on getting that certification. What do I need to do to get the certification? But maybe take a step back and think about, what do I need to do to be compliant and meet the intent of this? Because after you get certification, it doesn't end there. And that's another thing that we're kind of running into is, once we finish an assessment with a client, starting to talk through, hey, now these are the things that you're going to need to do. This is what you're going to need to think about going forward. Self-attestation in the ensuing years for your certification cycle. A lot of clients seem, I don't want to say ignorant to that, but they just have completely pushed that off. They're so focused on the certification that they're not thinking about the ensuing years. So I would implore organizations seeking certification to not be so dead set just on that cert, because then I think you're going to pop up the other end and then be like, oh crap, there's more to do. All right.
Thomas, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I just want to point out, I'm not the one that said you need to start drinking heavily this time.
You know what? You're right. It wasn't you. Good job.
No, Rob and Matt, they're absolutely, correct. I mean, a lot of the organizations, to Matt's point, it's that sprint, get your assessment. But that's just the first stop. You've still got to maintain it over 3 years, because guess what? I know technically maturity has been taken out of CMMC currently, but when you come back around for assessment and you said you've been doing, since we've been picking on risk assessments, let's say you've been doing risk assessments annually for each of those years, they can very well say, your documentation says that you've been doing this for 3 years. Okay, show me your risk assessment from 2 years ago. That is a valid piece of evidence that they can request. And if you can't show it, speak to it. That goes back to that warm and fuzzy that I was talking about. At the end of the day, for everybody that's listening in here, keep in mind, we've said it before, Noel, CMMC isn't the implementation. It's the validation of the implementation. When you start looking at those objectives that we've mentioned, is there 320 of them? Absolutely. But they essentially break down into 2 different things. 1, tell me how you're doing it. 2, prove to me you're doing it how you say you're doing it. That is the crux of the whole assessment. It's not very prescriptive. Yes, does it say you got to use FIPS 140-2 validated encryption? Absolutely. But it doesn't tell you which solutions you have to use to be able to do it. So just keep that in mind when you're going through, is that's that story component that, all of us and, other folks have said. Just tell us what you're doing and prove to us you're doing it that way. That's all you got to do.
Yeah, that's it. There you go.
Absolutely.
CMMC solved.
CMMC solved.
If only. Fully that was
That's the next webinar.
CMMC solved. Oh, thank you. No, that was really wonderful information, Thomas, and absolutely agree. Like you said, even though maturity isn't part of CMMC technically right now, to your point, if your assessor comes back 3 years later and you can't actually prove you've been doing that, then, I mean, how are they going to say that you're compliant?
No, absolutely. And one last point to that. We've been talking about CMMC assessors coming back. Keep in mind that none of this precludes you from the DCMA DIBCAC high spot checks.
Very true.
If they come in to spot check and see something out of compliance, not only are they going to ask you the question of why, but you have to hash and archive all of your evidence for 6 years. So that more than likely, if I was the assessor for DCMA, I would say, all right, let's open up your artifact package and let's see what you provided that time and see what the differences is.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
And we already see it happening, Noel. DIBCAC is already doing the spot checks.
Yeah, and we've seen that as well too. There's definitely been an uptick in the past few months for sure. So that's a very good point. Thank you. So just to kind of wrap up some of what we've been talking about, this is a question that I know pretty much everybody on this call is probably concerned with. All right, well, first of all, what is the average cost for a C3PAO assessment? And then the secondarily, how can I manage that cost to make it as small as I possibly can? And I'll leave that open for any three of you to answer or start off.
Yeah, I can start off. Getting on trusted source for information. Uh,
So it'd be great if we followed that out on calls with clients. Hey, well, how much? Hang on, give me a cigar.
I do. I use it a lot. No, so there's a wide variety. That's why, when Matt said go out and shop around for your C3PAOs, that's what he's talking about. It's more, remember, the C3PAO that you bring on board, it's really a partnership. It's not just them coming in to do an assessment. This is a long-term kind of partnership. If you really enjoyed working with them during the assessment, you're definitely going to be utilizing them again 3 years down the road. So keep that in mind. So it's more than just pricing. It's how well do you get along with those folks? Do you have the same ethics, morals, all those different kinds of things? Do you like to joke and laugh? Then maybe you want to look for that in your C3PAOs. But the prices range. We've seen as low as 20K all the way up to 100K. So it varies. Now there's different nuances that are being pushed in with that. So it's more than just a certification assessment. Some of the organizations, and Matt, I'm not sure how often you get this, but we at Redspin have a lot of folks saying they are scared of these 3-point and 5-point items that cannot go in the POAM, and it essentially is a pass-fail scenario for the OSCs. While that is very true, they are asking if we can do a mock assessment, which is also one of the questions, that was submitted. Can a C3PAO do a gap assessment or a mock assessment and still do the certification? The answer is yes, we can do a mock assessment, providing there's no consulting. But what they're asking us to do is run through their documentation and all their evidence to determine the 3-point and 5-point items are good to go. That way they know when they go on the certification, they got that peace of mind knowing they're not going to fail. There may be some anomalies, but at least it won't fail us.
And Rob, when you do those gap and mock assessments, because obviously you don't want to be in the consulting business, what does it look like? What does the OSC get from you?
Sure. Well, you'll get a picture of my Jack Daniels certificate. No, what you'll get back is simply a report that states, these are all the items that we looked at and they're either met or not met.
So sort of a thumbs up, thumbs down.
Exactly. Now if it's not met, you'll have a description as to why it is not met. Documentation does not suffice to describe what the organization is doing. Configuration says yada, yada, but the evidence provided shows a different configuration. You'll get that back, but you're not going to get a recommendation on how to
fix that.
Fix that. Right.
Gotcha.
So they're combining the mock assessment with the certification assessments. Now, when you do that, that drives that price up, right? Because you're now bogging down an assessor for 2 weeks, 3 weeks maybe to do the mock, and then you're using an assessment team to do the certification.
Right.
The main thing that disqualifies a C3PAO is if we do any type of consulting with you. We cannot grade our own homework. That's why, a lot of people find it interesting that, oh my gosh, you talk to all these other C3PAOs. Aren't they competitors? No, we're all in this boat together and we're all rowing to the same finish line. So whoever we have prepared, we're going to reach out to Matt and say, hey, what is your availability? Please, I'd like you to meet so-and-so. They do such and such for the DOD and are looking for a C3PAO to do their assessment. So all of that plays a role in the pricing.
That makes sense. And to your point, and the point that everybody's made here too, there are not many C3PAOs or assessors. So I'm sure that's also probably driving the cost up a bit too. Thomas, do you have any thoughts on that?
For me, that I'm jaded, Noel, this. There's a couple of things really that's playing in the price. I mean, one, is those on-sites. Part of the CMMC assessment process within the actual cap says a representative sample of all applicable cage codes have to be included. So what does that mean? Well, if you got 20 different cage codes and three different operational paradigms, more than likely that's what they're talking to. So you have to be prepared for that. The second thing is to Rob's point, there is a vast diversity in the C3PAOs out there. Yes, we all sign the same code of professional conduct. Yes, we all have to get certain certifications. Yes, we all have to have black in our wardrobe. But, and I think, Matt being the other C3PAO, you can agree here with me to a certain extent, the way that each organization goes about doing assessments, it may differ even if we have the cap in place. And that's just, honestly, it's based upon the lead assessor. Also, from a cost perspective, keep in mind that to a great extent, the cost of the assessments is not necessarily being driven by the C3PAOs. It's being driven by what the DoD requirements are. 32 CFR make very specific makeup requirements on the assessment team that I don't think anybody was really preparing for prior to that rule dropping, and that being a lead assessor, another CCA, as well as a third CCA that cannot be part of the assessment team.
Right, exactly. No, that's a very good point. Yeah, no, thank you, Thomas. And just to finish this up so we have some time for the Q&A, Matt, what have you seen as ways that people can, as an OSC, because, to Rob and Thomas's points, a lot of that stuff is out of their control. What's in their control when limiting that dollar amount?
Yeah, it is. And I'll just really quickly agree with everything I've heard thus far. I've heard the same ranges, and yeah, I think it varies. So definitely talk to multiple C3PAOs. And yes, we also do mock audits for clients, and I'm sure Rob and Redspin are the same way. For us, it was reactive. It was clients saying, I want some assurance. Can you guys do like a dry run with us first? And we were like, absolutely. And yeah, same thing. Hey, here's what was not met. Here's why. Here is nothing into how to fix that. That is where we would cross the line of independence that we will not cross. So it can give you a good sort of baseline as to like, the biggest feedback I'm getting from clients on mock audits is why they're feeling it's valuable. A lot of these organizations have not been audited for cybersecurity by anybody, any third party. This is the first time going through something like that. So them getting a sense of what actual specific evidence requests there are, what interview questions are asked of who within my team. Those are some of the things that they're finding valuable through the process, not just the actual end results, which are obviously extremely valuable. So yeah, definitely think about that if and when you're talking to C3PAOs, as well as like, do I want a mock audit? Is that included in the price? All those sorts of things. In terms of limiting scope, there are approaches that you can take with limiting scope. Obviously, if and whenever any of the sensitive data is going to be within a cloud provider, it needs to be FedRAMP authorized or equivalent per 32 CFR. But think about ways that you can limit your scope. Okay, can we have the data within a cloud provider and it's not flowing anywhere else, or we don't have multiple different cloud providers that it's flowing within? Think about, Thomas mentioned locations. Maybe that's a little bit less in your control, but locations is a huge scoping factor for us as well. It sounds like it's for Redspin as well. And to Thomas's point, like a lot of this is just driven by the requirements. It's not like the C3PAOs are just wanting to drive their prices higher and higher. Like the market is bearing it, I think, because it's just it's the work that is required on our end, not just from a scope perspective, but then from a personnel perspective as well. The 3 CCAs was not anticipated. I thought it was a good point, Thomas. And then again, going back to its current supply and demand, only so many CCAs for all of us C3PAOs to pull from. So, they're kind of saying highest bidder wins for my work, that sort of deal. That's basic supply and demand there. I do think, and I think this might be a question that we talked about, maybe touch on later, but I do foresee that getting better. The number of CCAs, number of C3PAOs, they will continue to increase. But as it stands right now, yeah, I think that's kind of the current state of things.
To give you some examples there, Noel, and leveraging Prevail, right? So we see a lot of organizations shifting to clouds. And why are they doing that? Because over the long haul, it is cheaper to maintain a cloud solution versus having to hire those resources and put them on staff to maintain that stuff. So when you shift to a cloud, as long as you're using, Microsoft leverages the Azure virtual desktop. Prevail has the application with the certificate-based access, right? So, and if you lock that environment down to where there's no printing, no removable media, all of that stuff, your scope tends to come down. And when you use those Azure virtual desktops or that application, that now takes the laptops out of scope, right? If you lock that whole environment down, that takes the physical requirements out of scope, and you don't have to have a physical on-site. So all of that plays a role in how to scope. Now, if you're unsure of what to do or how to go about doing that, ask a C3PAO, find an RPO. You can contact anybody at Prevail, Microsoft, any one of these folks, and they will tell you how you can get all that established. But the key is that scope. The further you get it down. Now, we've seen on-prem too, where a whole data center was actually involved in the full scope of the project versus another organization that took all the CUI data and put it on like 5 servers in their data farm. And the rest of the data center,
Everything else out of scope.
it was
Right.
just that little piece. So
Exactly. No, you're absolutely right on the scoping. Scoping is such an important way to pare that down. I hate to interrupt this conversation because it's fantastic, but we do have a ton of questions that I know that we need to get through. So Orly, we're ready to start looking at some questions if you're ready to start giving them to our panelists.
I am. And let me just jump right in, as there's dozens and dozens of them. Here's one. You mentioned the prospect of getting some sort of mock assessment, but outside of that, how do we know if we have all the right information from an external service provider to be ready for an assessment?
yeah, that is a great question, Orly.
You want to take that, Rob?
Yeah, so some of the C3PAOs, like us here at Redspin, we have what we call an artifacts list. So when you sign with us and our statement of work, that's one of the projects or one of the products we arm you with is that evidence list, and it lists out all 320 objectives and the evidence you can supply for those particular items. That is probably the best document that's out there that you can leverage. Many organizations and C3PAOs have these. It varies in differences, but we really took it from the DIBCAT team when we started the joint surveillance assessments and then kind of built it out from there over the assessments we've seen.
All right. Why don't we take this next question? How do you recommend documenting an organization's assets so that assessors can see how they align with the scoping guide? Why don't we throw that to Matt?
I think, again, this goes back to, and this is why the very early stages are very critical. And we talked about how do we reduce the scope. Follow the data. Where does the data flow? That's where you're going to be driven into what assets are in scope and where the fact that, obviously, again, you need to make sure that you're defining them. So depending on the specific asset, if you haven't, it sounds like whoever asked this probably is aware of that scoping guidance. There is a table on there, and then there's more description below. It depends on the type of asset. It's kind of the long and short of it. So there are different requirements for how and where to document each of the assets, depending on the asset type. And there's different asset categories. And so that level 2 scoping guidance from the DoD is kind of the authoritative source for that. They have again a table up top that's like a really quick read, but then the whole document kind of talks through in more detail specific examples. So the long and short of it is it depends a little bit per asset, but that document that was referenced outlines how and where to define those.
All right. Thomas, here, let's go this one for you. How do you test if you've been thorough enough with your interpretation of the CMMC controls and are audit ready?
So generally, when I'm talking to organizations, what I tell them is when you're doing your self-assessment, if you can provide 2 pieces of evidence for each objective, usually you're probably sitting in a pretty good place. I would say the other quantifier I would put on there is, can you provide 2 pieces of evidence from different methodologies based on NIST 800-171 alpha? And keep in mind, there's 3 assessors can use: examine, interview, and test. So if you can speak to it, you got a screenshot and you know where it's located, so you can do a screen share. Guess what? You have all 3 modalities, so you're probably going to be good to go.
All right. Good stuff. Here's another one. If an ERP provider that has a cloud offering, are they considered a CSP, a cloud service provider?
So if they are considered a CSP, orally, meaning there's within their own environment, they're storing, processing, or transmitting CUI, then 32 CFR is very clear. You have to be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. That's under those requirements. That's, outside of just a normal, ESP or ERP type vendor. If the ERP, if you're talking about within a contract documentation or an RFI, RFP, personally, I may question if that's really CUI, but it's up to the government to tell you when they're providing it to you. But if it's marked the CUI, you're told it's CUI, then yeah, you have to use a FedRAMP ERP in those situations.
Got it.
And I think because I get a lot of questions around FedRAMP and equivalency because we are also a 3PAO that does FedRAMP assessments. So this is a nice cross of both my worlds. I do get this question a lot as well. And I think it was at its core more like, hey, am I a CSP if I have a cloud offering, which almost implies yes. But in terms of, I do get this question a lot of like, okay, but how do I actually know like what definition is this based off of? I believe it's NIST 800-145, the definition, NIST definition of cloud computing that is referenced there. So I would go check that out if you want to kind of validate, but Thomas outlined the general framework of that. Yeah, if you're storing, transmitting, or processing that data within your cloud environment, you would be a CSP. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for that, Matt. Here is one for Mr. Robert. What are you looking at when it comes to multi-factor authentication?
Do you have it? That would be the first one. Second would be what type? What type are you using? What's the service or solution that you're using? And we again see a variety of MFA that's leveraged out there. So there's no right or wrong answer. If you're struggling to implement MFA across the organization, start with your privileged accounts, right? Then move to the folks that are, no kidding, accessing the CUI data. But it doesn't stop there. Once you get those in place, now you should be working to implement it across the rest of the organization for all levels of users. So really it's, do you have it in place? We're really going to check on those privileged accounts, but there is a requirement for MFA across the organization. So make sure you're watching for that, and whatever solution you can find that's manageable, one, and two, affordable, that's the solution you should probably go with.
All right. Kind of going from some of the minutia to a more high level, and I think this is not a bad question. What does a typical schedule look like for an assessment? I'm sure any one of you guys could answer.
Well, in general, I mean, this goes back to my point earlier that all C3PAOs are a little different in how they do things. If you look at the CMMC assessment process, there's 3 phases that are required of every assessment. Your phase 1, readiness review, it's getting that evidence, taking a look at it, your documentation, your SSP, your scoping. Phase 2 is, of course, the interviews, virtual, in person, roughly maybe 5 business days is a good average. And then phase 3, that is the reporting, where C3PAO takes all the information, puts it into some reports, gives it to QA, and then it's provided back to the organization. But there's also a dispute resolution window in there, as well as a window to provide additional evidence. So roughly that's 2 to 3 business weeks.
Is there an expectation of some part of this being on site?
Potentially. It depends on what your operational paradigm is. I know somebody mentioned in one of the questions orally that there seems to be some leeway in the cap for it. I can't speak for every assessor. I can't even speak for Rob, even though sometimes he might want me to. I can tell you for myself as an assessor, my personal integrity, because my name is tagged to your assessment. If you have on-prem CUI, you have on-prem infrastructure, it's got to be an on-site. There's been talk of doing virtual where somebody's walking around with a camera, a laptop, cell phone, whatever. As an assessor, that's really too easy to potentially hide things or not even see, everything we need to see. And that's my personal opinion. Do other C3PAOs do it differently? I can't speak to the other C3PAOs. All I can say is my job being, outside of an assessment, being VP CISO for Redspin, my job is to always play devil's advocate, as Rob likes to say, for all of our stuff. And what that means is I'm thinking of worst case scenario. So any of the assessments that we upload, well, DCMA is going to be doing spot checks of us too. And, I have a fiduciary responsibility to ensure the integrity of not only our assessment, but the information you as an OSC is providing. So your certification, both of those tests that or survive that test of scrutiny. That way you're not running into a scenario where the certification's revoked. We as a C3PAO, our assessments are coming into question, but that's us. I can't speak for Matt or any other C3PAO.
Yeah, I would just echo that really quickly. We take the same approach. I mean, when I get asked this question in initial scoping conversations of, hey, do you need to come on site? I just basically exactly what Thomas just mentioned. Hey, do you have physical CUI? Do you have physical infrastructure? That's kind of the most high level answer to whether we would need to come on site or not. And I think, this is a good question. Obviously, you want to understand the timeline. I echo, we've seen about 5 business days on the actual phase 2 of the assessment, but there is the nuance that Dr. Thomas was going into there that I like to go into with clients of, hey, there is that potential extra 10 business days to supply additional evidence. There is phase 4. Do you go into phase 4 or not for additional POEM closeout? That could be 180 days. So it depends a little bit. And then even on phase 1 and some of the upfront stuff, I tell clients this all the time. I see a huge variability with how long does it take you to get everything to us that we need. So if you're counting from the very beginning of when we initially request stuff until you're actually certified, it greatly depends on which of those paths you end up going down. But, it's good to understand what those paths and those options could be.
All right, gentlemen, this has been a great discussion. First of all, thank you guys very much for this great discussion. It's been really informative. I know I've learned a lot from hearing you guys, and thank you. As everyone else says, thank you, who's in on this call. So Thomas, Matt, and Rob, thank you again. You guys are great. Look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.
Yeah, we can do it, Orly. Bye, Noel.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye, Noel. Thanks, Orly. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time with us today.